Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be talking about mental health in sports, and we're going to be doing so with Olivia Bramley and Laura Healy. Welcome Olivia, welcome Laura.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Hi Dan, how are you doing?
Yeah, good. Super excited to have you both on today to discuss what I think is a really interesting, really important topic. We've been talking a lot lately on the Sports Psych Show about mental health, and we're going to carry on that conversation. Before we do, let's do some introductions. Laura, you've been on the Sports Psych Show before, so welcome back. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your work.
Yeah, thanks Dan. Thanks so much for having me back on. So I'm Laura Healy. I'm a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at Nottingham Trent University, and sort of teach and research in that role. So research interests broadly lie around goal setting, motivation and mental health, and sort of some overlaps in between those different areas. And obviously today we're focusing on the mental health aspects. I guess I'm actively involved in sport outside of my job, my 9 to 5. So I play and coach hockey, predominantly coaching at the youth end of things, but have done adult coaching as well.
I think I probably, in the episode that you appeared, I think it was a couple of years ago, I probably asked you a few questions about your hockey. How is the hockey going?
Yeah, it's all good. I've recently come back from sort of maternity leave, both at work and hockey. So it's been a learning curve in terms of that, and also a bit of a juggle, abandoning my children with various spectators at the side of the pitch while I go on and play. But I played for a couple of teams within our club, and we recently got to the quarterfinal of the over 35s cup, which was really fun. Actually, we lost out on penalty flicks, but it was a really good day, and we performed probably as well as we could have done. So that was really enjoyable.
Congratulations, that's awesome. I'm going to sound like a real psychologist now and suggest that your kids therefore could be used as some kind of contextual interference effect.
Yeah,
it could really distract.
It was that day, as one of them cried for the whole first half, which was really fun. But yeah, my eldest son cried on Saturday when we told him that the hockey season was nearly finishing, because he really enjoyed watching us play. Whether it's watching us play or eating the chips afterwards, I'm yet to be seen. But yeah, no, it's nice to bring them along with us.
Future England hockey player.
Maybe his dad's Irish, so we'll have to have that discussion later down the line. But I guess we've got options.
Brilliant, big competition there between nations. And coming to you, Olivia, tell us a little bit about yourself, Olivia, and tell us about your work.
Yeah, so Olivia here, and I'm a current PhD student at RMIT University, which is based in Melbourne, Australia. So I have just recently been living in Australia. I'm a former student at Nottingham Trent University, obviously, where I did the piece of work we're going to touch on today, and that was with Laura and Mustafa. So really great team. And like I said, then ended up following my graduation, moved to Australia, started a PhD, which is more now kind of transitioned in the sport management area. So actually looking at sustainability in sport, but general interests, and kind of, I think my broader research area is how do we ensure the positives of sport happen. So I think we're really maybe rose tinted when we consider the sport environment at elite and grassroots level. We're like, sport's great, as fans we love it brings all these positive benefits in life, whereas actually like there's a lot of negatives to it. And I think it was just in December, actually, I went to a conference, and Professor Aaron Smith was talking about, he had like a list of red and green things, like the red things that sport was like not so great at, and the green list, and there was quite a lot of red. So my research is definitely like, how can we make the environment of sport, individually for players, as athletes, but also from a sport management point of view as well. How can we create sporting environments and sport businesses that actually enable them positives? And like I said, that can be an individual level, or like more like an organisational point of view. So I think that's like my broad area where I want to go, and kind of how I'd say crossover in my previous work and current work, and even some like research assistant work comes in. And just trying to use the skill set to apply it across those contexts. But yeah, back in the UK, because I recently just signed a professional football contract as well. So a bit of a dual career at the moment. So currently playing in the Women's Championship for Durham. And that was just as of January. So a bit of a juggle at the moment, but it's all good fun.
Fantastic. Life is busy. What took you out to Australia in the first place? Was it the PhD?
No, actually. So I did my placement in Australia. So when I was in my undergrad, I did the sandwich course. So in my third year I went over to Australia and worked for an Australian football club as like a GPS coordinator, and then also as a research assistant. I think that's when I first probably got a taste of research and was like, oh, actually, this feels like my calling. Like this, I really enjoy it. I love to learn, and so I did that and just loved, being out in Australia. Loved the culture. It was amazing. And then coincidentally as well, like my partner's a dual citizen for Australia, so kind of during COVID and like I said, after I'd graduated, we thought, okay, it's time to spend some time over there and with my partner's family. So we actually ended up moving to South Australia in Adelaide, which is beautiful. And then the PhD just came up, and I almost did take a PhD focused on elite sport and mental health at ECU, but I think just like when you're an early career researcher, like you just try and navigate exactly, a PhD is a long project. So what at the time did I feel like was aligning with where I wanted to go? And like I said, bit of an overlap in terms of that broader interest, but that's just kind of how my path took place, really.
Did you play much soccer out there?
I did. Played pretty much as soon as I got off the plane, because it was during COVID, right. So we had to do a 2-week hotel quarantine. So I stayed, we did this crazy grit and body pump and all this in the hotel room, and got someone to bring us weights from one of my friends, and then we got out, and the first thing I was looking at was okay, where's the league? What football team can I join? I think literally within 2 weeks I was training at a football club. I did play football, but just wanted to take my game to the next level, and like I said, take on that professional status and become full-time. And just because of visa reasons, it's very difficult over there to kind of go up to the top league there. So I was kind of sitting at tier 2 there, which isn't quite the same as over here. And with the Women's World Cup last year, when that all happened in Australia, I just thought, wow, this is just reminded me of home and, home of football. So came on back. And
I was going to ask you about the World Cup. I mean, like many people over here, I was completely gripped, watched it from the very start to the very end. And obviously Spain were magnificent in the final, but England were brilliant all the way through. I mean, what was the feeling out there? I mean, Australia, I suppose, isn't necessarily known for its soccer, but it's such a growing sport out there, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. And I think the way the Matildas have grown, and probably from the World Cup, but even into the build-up of the World Cup, is huge. So everyone knows the Matildas, and I don't know how much that is perhaps filtering down at this stage. I don't know the knock-on effects at the other leagues in terms of resources and professionalism, but in terms of the actual sport and the profile, it's growing. And they've just announced a fixture for Adelaide for the Matildas. They've not been played there in 10 years, and it's sold out. People literally were queuing on the website to get tickets, and amazing. That's at a full stadium. And the big stadiums in Melbourne, like Sydney, when it was the semi-final with Australia, England. Obviously, it was heavy Aussie kind of support fan base.
Yeah.
But when Sam Kerr scored that goal, I've genuinely never heard a roar that loud in the stadium. Even I've been to lots of men's games, not for other women's games. I've been to see England on home soil as well. But the roar, when Sam Kerr scored that goal, it was just incredible. It was, I just can't describe it. So definitely something that's growing over there as well, and the professionalism as we see it here is on that upwards trajectory.
I think the roar is motivated by the fact that it was against the old enemy. That's why.
Yeah, probably.
But look, it's great to have you back in England and plying your trade in the professional game, and wishing you the very best of luck in that. And we're here today to discuss, unpack a paper that you've both written, Olivia, that you've led on, and to talk more broadly about this specific subject. The paper, as I say, Olivia, you've led on, Laura, your co-writer, and also Mustafa Sarkar, who's been on the show a number of times. The paper is Mental Ill Health in Semi-Elite Women's Soccer in England. So you're investigating mental ill health in semi-elite women's soccer. Why this, Olivia? I mean, you've spoken a bit to this already, but what's the motivation behind uncovering a little bit more about players' experiences of mental ill health within this specific population?
Yeah, so I think it's probably twofold. So I remember at the time, more of from an applied point of view, is I was obviously still in England playing at tier 3 myself at a semi-elite level. And like I said, as we've seen the professionalism increase, there has been a change of the environments in like women's football. And I just think I kind of looked around me and had lots of teammates or hearing stories of other players and other teams of just genuinely really struggling and experiencing not flourishing, and having like mental ill health and just a lack of support, and kind of not it wasn't on a purpose thing, no one said there's wishing anyone is struggling or anything like that, but just the nature of kind of how the growth of the game was going, but the lack of perhaps resources at those semi-elite levels, and sort of no one really knowing how to support players better. So it sort of came from that. So I was like, okay, well, from a recent, like, I have an opportunity during my dissertation as an undergrad to really perhaps, take a piece of research that we can take seriously and actually have an impact. So that was quite a big driver, like I said, trying to make the most of that research opportunity I had, and really wanted to investigate that issue. So, was this just something perhaps I was in tune to and was maybe in my immediate environment, or was this quite a widespread matter? And to what extent? So, and with that, in terms of the extent, the prevalence, but also, well, what were people's experiences? Where were the sources of this was coming from? Like, why aren't players flourishing in these environments? Because, like I said, like no one's trying to make anyone have mental ill health or anything like that. So, I wanted to dig deeper into that. And then I think at the time of when we first designed this piece of research, from a research point of view, is it was really kind of under researched. And I think generally we're like women in sport, women in research growing. So we are now looking at specific environments and context specific. But at the time, like, that was really early, and there was only a lot of talk about mental health in elite environments, which is great. But again, maybe a bit of an assumption, but there is more resources there perhaps to tap into at those levels. So what about the middle group where there's still the pressure, there's still the same expectations, or especially now as the professionalisation of women increases, that's growing. But okay, like, how are we aligning with that? How we're developing them environments and helping players flourish? So that was main driver. And now there is a lot more research. The work of like Carly Perry is really fantastic, and what she's doing, and obviously really going into that even more detail. But generally that's kind of where it all started.
And Laura, coming to you, and you mentioned earlier mental health is an area of interest to you coming into this research project. What's your involvement in mental health research been? And was this a new population to study for you?
Yeah, so I guess mental health and well-being has always been involved within sort of my research areas. I probably hadn't looked at it in sort of the specific population that we were looking at here. Some of my previous work have been looking at it within community settings and more thinking about physical activity. But some of my sort of work, which is more goal pursuit related, had looked at sort of mental well-being in athlete populations, and particularly in student athletes. And so I think there's a lot of resonance here. While that wasn't the focus of this paper, the idea of people are athletes and something else, so working or studying, we recognise that actually that's quite a unique scenario that people have to navigate, and both from like the identity perspective, but also the stresses in those two unique environments. And we also know they can sometimes really complement each other and sometimes really challenge the two. So I think there were lots of things that interested me around sort of Liv's suggestion of looking at mental health in this population. I'd played a lot of football growing up, and I could recognise a lot of the challenges that Liv was talking about in terms of the growth of the women's game. And so I guess from a personal level, it had been great to see how far we'd come from when I was a child playing women's football, when there really weren't many opportunities at all. But I guess a bit disheartening seeing how actually lots of the challenges which I had experienced really hadn't gone away in another way. And so I guess from a personal level, it was interesting in that respect too.
And coming back to you, Liv, I mean, What does mental health and mental ill health mean to you? And perhaps you could give us a description sort of prior to your study here, or even a description from your study. I don't mind. And perhaps that description kind of changed for you as you started to learn a little bit more about the academic area here. But yeah, what does that sense of mental health and mental ill health mean to you?
Yeah, so I think my personal, how I perceived it before this piece of research, and going through this research, and now since we've developed it, has been quite similar, because I think often external stuff, like a lot of people assume mental health is kind of you're happy, or you have depression, or you have anxiety, or you have some sort of mental illness, which is obviously not the case. Like, so we definitely took on a very holistic definition, which is what I align with. So I do think it is kind of more of, it's like mental health generally is quite dynamic, and it's a state of well-being where we can, at one end you might be flourishing, you see your potential, you see a purpose, and you have meaning. And then, in terms of the context of sport, that is, you have meaning in your sport, but also in life, and you can like cope with those stresses, and again in life and in your sport. But then on the flip side of that, we can have the other end of the continuum, which is a mental illness. And we obviously, it wasn't clinically defined in this study in terms of, we didn't look at those with, they weren't clinically diagnosed with depression or anxiety, but those higher levels of symptoms that relate to these disorders. So yeah, it's in, and like from day to day, you could change on that continuum, but obviously then if you get to the more severe ends, where you're lavishing and you are being clinically diagnosed with a mental illness, then that would look obviously very different to where you are somewhere else in the continuum that probably is more stable. But at the same time, your symptomology doesn't have to be fixed. It can change, like I said, is quite dynamic and depend on the context you're in as well. So that's definitely how we use it for this paper and my own personal kind of alignment.
And Laura, I'll come over to you in a second, but just staying with you, Olivia, your experiences of mental health, mental ill health, and the conversation around this at the level of semi-elite women's soccer. And I would use that interchangeably with, for instance, college soccer in the US, anywhere where perhaps it's not the absolute adult elite professional level where people are taking their sport seriously. That's kind of how I would define this. And please do correct me if I'm wrong or mistaken there. But I'd love to know, the openness that players have around mental health and mental ill health, the conversation. Is there much conversation?
I think what we discovered from this, and feeds into a little bit of research I actually supported in Australia, and this relates to community actually, and youth sport. But there is almost a almost like there is still a stigma.
Okay.
So we assume, like, now we talk about mental health, and because you talk about it and you accept it, the stigma is reduced. But I think when you go to sports environments, especially as you push into those high levels, like I said, when you are taking it competitively, I think it's almost it's still there. It still exists very much. So there are a lot of, even at the elite level, a lot more perhaps people talking about it. It's coming through in the media. A lot of high elite sports teams now might have a sports psychologist, a wellbeing officer, but it's also then, well, how is that implemented? And then I think from more of a broader point of view, which is what we touch on later in the discussion in the paper, is that systems approach. So from a real broad perspective, like, how do we still perceive like the athlete and the expectations we put on them? And again, how do you internalize that as a player? So yes, definitely more of an openness, like I said, from myself. And I try and, as an athlete myself at a high level now, like, I try and really talk about it and try and normalize it, and try and say, well, your mental health can be decoupled from your performance as well. Like, it doesn't have to be within the environment, it's external. But at the same time, I think there's still probably a mentality of trying to be tough, or those masculine ideals that, are just so ingrained in the sport.
And coming over to you, Laura, I suppose same question as a hockey player, as an academic researcher. Perhaps, as you stated, you haven't necessarily studied this specific population around mental health, but do you think the conversation is changing? Do you think there's more discussion? And we can talk about all levels here of sport.
I certainly think the conversation is changing. I guess where I would be less confident saying there is a change is how that is actually changing in practice. I think, yes, we've got a lot more research in the area, which is vastly needed. I think we've got, we're doing some work at the moment looking at evaluating mental health systems. The fact that we have mental health systems is obviously a huge development from where we were not really that long ago. I think the problem is that we still have sporting environments being created which do not optimise mental health in a way which they could do. You look at things like the White Report, which was a slightly different area, but you look at the kind of environments which are still being created within all levels of sport. In that case it was gymnastics, but I think we can translate a lot of those things to other sports. You look at the recent report in swimming, that we are still experiencing, performers and coaches are still experiencing environments which not just challenge their mental health, actually, negatively impact it. And so I guess while I would say that there is definitely increased attention, rightly so, on it, I still think we really don't have many of the answers further than let's talk about this a bit more. And actually what we really need to look at is how can we really change practices to ensure that perhaps we don't need so many of those mental health systems within sport, because the whole sporting environment is promoting better mental health. That doesn't mean that individual athletes aren't going to experience periods of ill health, because they are human and fallible, and even in the most supportive environments, people will still experience periods of mental ill health. But I do wonder whether we're still not quite getting it right in terms of creating these kind of environments which allow people in the best of circumstances to flourish.
Well, this paper, Mental Ill Health in Semi-Elite Women's Soccer in England, I'd love to unpack this paper, discuss the results and the findings and the discussion you have as a consequence of those results. Coming back to you here, Liv, take us through how you went about this research project.
Yeah, so when we designed it, I was very much interested in, we want to assess the whole population. So we did take both the North and the South League, because Tier 3 is split into North and South. So we did want to assess the prevalence across. But, and this is probably me as quite a researcher, I do love a mixed method, but I am probably more qualitatively inclined, because I do think it's really important to add context and understand individual experiences. So that's where this did become almost two parts to it. So we did want to follow up on talking to players about their specific experiences. But it is a bit of a biased sample in terms of those we did interview were those that on the measures we use showing that higher symptomology. So, we didn't necessarily look at the individuals with that were perhaps flourishing or that had lower scores in them environments. We did just target specifically a sample with higher symptomology of mental ill health. So obviously it would be really interesting to see on the flip side of that. But yeah, for this study we did, just because we wanted to see, what is these worst case scenarios? Like, what are the different things we can unpack from those perhaps experiencing the most difficult and challenging experiences. So yeah, that's how we went about it. One, to check the prevalence to see how widespread the mental ill health or like those high levels symptomology were across the two leagues and within different teams, to see if it was, was it just a context specific thing or was it widespread? And then, to really dig into those experiences, perhaps what are the triggers and what is the narrative perhaps leading to those high levels of mental illness.
Well, I do love unpacking narratives, and I'd like to do that now. you write in the research paper about the personal and individual stories of those that you interviewed. You came out with some themes, so it would be brilliant to talk through those themes. It starts a theme of navigating Tier 3 women's football, a balancing act. I suppose staying with you here, Liv, can you tell us a little bit about this theme?
Yeah, so this first thing was pretty much centered around the nature of dual careers. And I think this does, now I know this applies definitely even the next level tier two. Like I'm a dual careerist and a lot of my, teammates are dual careerists at the moment. So, but yeah, definitely at tier three, like I said, the professionalism and the expectations of the sport have increased. So even at tier three now, and probably not quite at the time, but now there's one or two teams that are full time or full time as you would perceive, but perhaps the financial nature of what full times mean doesn't equate to the schedules. You do have to have a job or outside of the sport, and that just poses two stresses. So if we're looking at everyday life stresses, you have that from your job or family life, etc. But then at the same time, we're then experiencing the same pressures, competitive environments, perhaps not full time, but really high performance expectations, and trying to juggle those different dual careers. Like I said, whether that's your job or being at university, and not really having the support to manage that. And although, like I said, the performance expectations and the competitive nature of the environments and the scheduling has changed and grown, which is great for the sport, actually like trying to navigate that and process that as a player is like presenting lots of kind of unintended consequences in terms of mental health. So that was generally what that theme was centered around. So if Laura, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing which jumps out for me is I think in this context, we have this in all sports of the drop in between professional and non-professional exists at some point, and there's always going to be that challenge in between. We have this, you go up just one level and you're in a professional environment, and you go just down one level and you're not. I think the problem is within this context is that's really high bar. These are players who are playing at an extremely high level, as we talked about in the paper. Some of them are playing at international level, yet they are still having to navigate these challenges. And so I think that's probably a really not completely unique, but a unique thing about some of the population here is they are competing at this really, really high level with the expectations around performance, some of the things that they might be having to do to support that performance. So, things like S&C, like nutrition, like physio, yet they're also trying to fit all that around studying, working, having this identity outside of sport, and just the sort of where that threshold is really high in the competitive level in this sporting context compared to perhaps some other sports where you're dropping much further down a ladder before you're getting to a non-professional level.
And Liv, this theme must resonate with you, perhaps because you've competed at a level whereby perhaps the resources haven't necessarily been there to support the athletes within the environment that you've competed in, and the structures in place haven't necessarily been as professional as one would like. Would that be fair to say? Would this theme be something that you feel that you've made your way through and continue to make your way through, and it continues to be a challenge to be able to balance life? You've got to balance your playing, your studies, your PhD studies. You've got to try to be as professional as you can be with high expectations, yet you don't necessarily have the same kind of resources that maybe one might have in the men's side of the game. You play championship football, you play to an extraordinary high level. You might not have the same kind of resources where you are right now, which is a step above. This theme must resonate with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's probably only through experience and, over a fair few years that actually, whereas like this balancing act, like it's definitely some experience, but it's something where I personally have kind of learned or like grinded out to find a way to flourish, but that has only come from, like I said, experience and having my own low and poor mental health. Like really experiencing the moments and having to kind of figure out, well, how do I get that balance right? And I personally feel really fortunate to have like really great support network outside of the sport. So if I think about like my PhD team and my supervisors for my PhD, of like how supportive they are with like my dual career, and like I said, I've been able to come back to England, so that's a pressure weight off my shoulders, that I have a supervisor that can be flexible, that does support both, that recognises the importance of both, and then again like a family that perhaps from a logistics and a practical point of view and emotionally, they also support me in that way. So but it has taken probably a very long time for that balancing the balance of all of them. And like Laura's mentioned before, like that identity point of view, well, I get a lot of the time, and I'm talking very personally here, and this doesn't necessarily isn't specific to anything we kind of written paper, but is I do get caught up in that identity piece of, one day, today I've come off the football pitch, I'm a footballer, and then the next, like, I'm a researcher, and well, like, where do you have value, or like who do you get value from, and are your needs, like a basic human needs as a person, met through what you're doing, and kind of trying to flip, and yeah, like I said, just that perhaps lack of resources. But I don't know, and again, a bit of like Laura said before, like, I don't know if it is just a resource thing, and it is quite a broad sport thing in terms of, as a footballer, or when I have my football hat on, like, do people actually care about anything else you do when you're in the football world? Like, and that again then takes away from how you might feel about that second career you have, or the value, or that adds another additional stressor. And like, do people really kind of give you any validation for that? And I think it takes a while to just go, I'm doing my own thing, I'm paving my own way, this is kind of, I want to live this life, and finding what works for you. But it definitely presents many challenges.
And I think that's an interesting point about whether it's a football thing or not, because I think women's football culture, and I'm getting outside of my lane here because I'm straying towards being a sociologist, which I'm not, but women's football culture is really interesting, because actually we have an opportunity to not just base it on men's football culture, because there are some really negative aspects of men's football culture, and it has developed in a different way and at a different time, but I think there's a risk. So I think, if you look at like around the dual career literature, which I appreciate this is not necessarily exactly what we're looking at in this paper, but there's lots of evidence to say that actually people who have dual careers can really flourish, and that can provide opportunities for them to do better. And I think, Liv is a really good example of that. We have other people that anecdotally we know are better athletes because they have an opportunity to do something else alongside. We don't tend to offer that within men's football. It's one of the only sports, and appreciate people will say, oh, we give them education, but if you look at lots of other sports, the route to professionalism is through university, and I think that's where women's sport has largely gone, and women's football has largely gone. If you want to be a professional athlete, even with the advent of things like the WSL, the route has been go to university that will allow you to train and study at the same time, and we will largely support you to do both. But it's interesting hearing Liv saying that, perhaps now she's come out of the sort of undergraduate university and perhaps playing at a different level outside of that, maybe the support for being something other than a footballer isn't there. And I guess the question is, maybe we should be encouraging more footballers to do something else other than be a footballer if they want to, because obviously within the paper we're talking about how this is a real challenge because they're having to do it. But I guess what we wouldn't want to say, Liv, based on our findings, that should be something we shouldn't encourage if people want to do it, if that's important to them.
Yeah, exactly. And my supervisor, Emma Sherry, she's always saying to me, like, when I have got a bit flustered with like trying to juggle the two, she goes, but if you didn't have one without the other, like, where would you like balance yourself out almost? So, like, say if I come off the football pitch and I've had a mare of a game, or I'm not getting as many minutes as I'd like, well, actually I have another purpose in life, so I'll go and get my head in my PhD, or have a great meeting or something like that, and that's away from that. Or, you know, if I'm getting a bit stuck with my PhD and I think, oh, I can't write one more word, then I actually go and have a really fantastic training session, and kind of you don't put all your emotional capacity and like you're not all your value is just based on a sport that is really reliant on external validation. You know, especially I think I've probably learned that coming into, like I said, more of a professional setting, is that it really is like, you know, your worth can be so heavily reliant on someone else's opinions, but they can be so subjective that actually if you have something else outside of your sport, and you know, it doesn't have to be a full-time career or anything, but just something else that adds value to your life, and that it can be really positive. But it is those structures that you either build for yourself or that we need to develop in football environments, or like you said, your my own support network from friends, family, like colleagues, whatever. That's what we have to navigate around to make sure it is the environments and it is that balance and it is the routine you have that allows flourishing, and that, you know, like I said, will go up and down, and I'm sure there will be days where I will be very blue and very down and whatever, and like I said, get very lost and flustered. But on the whole, can I always, you know, be in those environments and the context where flourishing can happen and does happen?
I'm going to try and reflect back some of the things I've heard over the last few minutes. I just think it's absolutely fascinating. I think the overarching theme that I heard from your conversation between the two of you there was that the women's side of the game has this wonderful opportunity potentially to present a new reality of human participation and human performance within sport, from semi-professional sport through to fully professional sport. What I'm hearing, the overarching theme being the importance of a psychologically informed environment. That sophisticated relationship really centers around a psychologically informed environment where everybody's invested in the thoughts, the feelings, the experiences, the personalities of its participants. You know, within that pie, and there's so many things that you can, obviously big debates as to what a pie is in our profession, right? And I think there's just so many things you can throw into that pie. I'm hearing the importance of multiple identities, the maintenance of multiple identities, rather than experiencing identity foreclosure, having that one identity. And really that sophisticated relationship with participation and performance is understanding that actually we can have these multiple identities and still thrive in our game and flourish as a person. I'm hearing, you know, I've heard things like that, values and self-worth, and I also wrote down this term meaning systems, which, you know, that making meaning of what you're doing influences how you feel within your environment. You know, I also wrote down, and maybe we're going to preempt coming on to some other themes here, but the importance of understanding joy and seriousness, that actually they don't have to be at two ends of the same continuum. I think I've said this before on the Sports Psych Show. I honestly don't think joy and seriousness have to be on the same ends of the same continuum. They can be on different continuums, that we can actually be high in joy and high in seriousness at the same time. But we have to do, where everyone looks at it maybe from a slightly negative lens and say, well, you've got to do a lot of mental gymnastics to reach what you're saying there, Dan. Or, you know, one sees it as, this can actually be achieved with great coaching, with really good sophisticated environments. As you mentioned, Laura, I mean, you filled in a lot of gaps there, Liv, but you mentioned, Laura, you know, the women's game has this opportunity to build this really good environment across the board. No question. Any thoughts back at me there?
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting, and I think I guess I don't want to be too critical of sports, because as Liv said, there's so much great stuff that goes on in sport. But I guess it's about how can we promote that a bit more, and how can we create these environments where people can perform to their maximum because they are allowed to you know, experience sport in the right way, I guess. And I think, you know, across all levels that could be we could do a bit better, I think, and that's really hard. It's not, there's definitely not a simple solution to it, but I think if that's the North Star, then it starts to move us in the right direction a little bit.
I think neat segues all the way around onto the next theme. Football, is it good for my mental health?
Mm-hmm.
And we may have spoken a bit to this. I'm not too sure, Olivia, but if you can briefly unpack this theme, that would be great.
Yeah, so this was related to kind of specific stresses, but also the positive elements of sport. So all the participants we spoke to, even, when they were talking about the most challenging times and experiences they've had in the past, it's actually really like a lot of positives that come out of playing football. So that was, joy, kind of switching off, letting off steam. I think that was kind of what one participant referred to. Developing friends, and feeling like you are, like Laura's as well, like working towards a goal, enabling to have success, and obviously everyone loves the feeling of winning. So those kind of special moments in sport, and being a part of the collective, and often there was some good elements of how coaches had positive impacts as well to support players that those with perhaps higher anxiety symptomology, or that were overly perhaps critical of themselves and experienced more depressive symptoms often, and how coaches can actually, although players are experiencing these emotions and symptoms, that actually coaches could have a really positive impact on still kind of enabling them to succeed and flourish. But then also, like I said, it is that question, because there are specific stressors. So, when someone gets injured, how do we navigate around that, and different stages of the injury? When you first get injured, what is your emotional response then? During then, you rehab. Do you, some people working towards feeling more positive, but actually, kind of as your motivation decreases, how does that affect your mental health? And things like deselection. So when you are dropped, and okay, well, how does that challenge your mental health, and in what context does that challenge your mental health and lower your mental health? And that could be things around like communication channels, and how you valued within the team. So that was kind of generally what that theme was centered around, and just going through back and forth, where it was the good and the bad.
Laura, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just highlights this, everything's nuanced, right? In terms of, it's not as simple as saying football or sport in general is good for mental health, because it really can be, and it can have really positive benefits. But in the same individuals, it can also be really poor for mental health, and that can change over time. It can change as environments and contexts change, and so as I said, I think that's one of the aspects of this paper which is really strong, is we're not just saying that football is really bad for mental health, but we're recognising there are real benefits for the participants that Liv spoke to, but also that there are other considerations which, there are times when sport is perhaps not having the positive impact that we might like to have, and I'm not sure we're going to get to a utopia where mental health is not, or mental ill health isn't prevalent in sport, and equally, the things which can challenge our mental health in sport are sometimes inherent with it. We feel crushed by a loss, or we feel really disappointed about a deselection. Those really strong emotions and some of the mental health challenges which come with those experiences are unlikely to be taken away. But I don't think that means we can't look at what's going on around it in order to try and minimize the impact of some of those things as much as possible.
It's really interesting listening to you both there. Again, I've written some things down here that just popped into my head in terms of the importance of organisations looking at this from a systemic perspective. And I think you mentioned this earlier, Olivia. Culturally, what do we say and do? from macro structures down to mesosystems. What do we say and what do we do? At the mesosystemic level, we can look at medical departments. You mentioned there, Olivia, injury. How do we treat injury, not just from a physical perspective, a physiotherapeutic perspective, but from a psychological perspective? What do we inject into our culture that means we look after our people and thus manage mental health? So there was that came through. I was thinking as you were both speaking, and a colleague of both of yours who was the fellow researcher on this paper, Mustafa Sarkar, and I know that this work doesn't necessarily relate to mental health specifically, but more to the resilience literature that he's done around the importance of the balance between challenge and support. And how that's relevant not just for resilience, but also for mental health, which has a partnership anyway. And then just as you were speaking at the beginning, Olivia, and you were talking about the importance of positivity, I suppose, in any environment, which makes sense. It made me think of the work of positive psychologist Barbara Fredrickson and her 3-to-1 ratio. How often do we think about that? That feeling happy, a sense of well-being, often starts with this 3-to-1 ratio, 3 positive things to 1 negative thing. So I think it's, all the way around. These are actual practical things that organisations can consider within their environment, within their culture. As always, no question, just a bunch of reflections back at you.
Yeah, and I think the idea of high challenge, high support is really key, and I think that's how, as academics, as practitioners, that's a really useful framework to sell this work to coaches and other people within sport, because we're not trying to change the hard work and the sort of determination and the levels of persistence and the commitment which are required to excel within sport. But if we can use all those, create those really challenging environments that we know really help development, whilst also supporting that development, perhaps we can just create this a situation where the context is not causing the mental ill health. And I think that's what's really important to state. As I said, we're not going to remove mental ill health from sport in the same way. We're not going to remove it from society, but we can at least take steps to make sure that when it's experienced, there is support available, and that we're not causing it. We're not the cause of that mental ill health.
Yeah, I was going to add and say, similar, like I think we just touched on it before, but again, we're not removing the pressure. Like you said, like some of the cause, like what we might perceive as a cause as well, like especially as a player, and like even from a research paper of this, like we're not saying like, we can't have competitive environments or we can't have high pressured situations. No, they are like inherently a part of high performance sport and should be. We don't. Not everyone wants to play participation. Like that's. I've actively chose to go and put myself into a high performance situation where it is highly critical, and it is, like every day you're turning up and having to rely on, like I said, external validation. Like you're putting yourselves in these really challenging environments. But like Laurie's saying, well, and yourself, like at a meso level, like, okay, how can we prevent things perhaps becoming catastrophic? So as an individual, if your response to someone could really thrive from a really high competitive environment, and somebody else in that same environment is going to experience mental ill health. So that person that does experience mental ill health, how can we almost support it not being catastrophic, but also allow them the chance to flourish and understand them as an individual? And again, that's where, like you said, some of the practical, more meso level things might come into place. Or if you can't say no player's ever going to get injured. Like, of course, like we're going to put your bodies on the line. Like that's the nature of a sport. But when you are injured, okay, like what steps can you do so you don't spiral into severe mental ill health? And how can we ensure we have those, like you said, 3-to-1 positive experiences? So where do we get the 3 from? Like what does that look like? And again, that probably is where, like we said, like where we're not quite at in the practical world of, all right, well, what does that actually look like? And I think that would be, like, again, a follow-up from this paper would be really interesting to talk to those that do have positive mental health, that have had at a time point. And well, okay, what did that actually look like? Were there any differences? What was the context around that time? And like I said, just giving more opportunities for that across your experience in sport.
I could talk to both of you about this all day. We're on slightly limited time this afternoon, and I am keen to just briefly cover the final theme that came through from your research, if we can. So this final theme is speaking out about my mental health, the confusion and the cost. Back to you, Olivia. Just briefly unpack this theme for us.
Yeah, so like we spoke about before, the conversation has definitely shifted, and there is definitely more awareness and openness to talk about your mental health to come forward. But kind of despite this change in culture in both sport and in wider society, when we're talking about our mental health, there are still barriers to help seeking. A little bit a limited understanding of like what actual mental health is to people within sport on an individual level. So there wasn't necessarily consistent environments that did foster a culture of well-being, or that did encourage kind of those open dialogues of mental health. And again, just a bit of confusion on what is the appropriate support, and are there support networks, or like tangibly, like what does that look like, and how does that again become compatible in the football environment. Yeah, and there was definitely things that came out again relating back to perhaps falling back into the masculine ideals. So I know we spoke about women's sport does have that real unique position to kind of change the narrative, but in football there's a high comparison to the men. So I think one participant discussed about women being emotional, but from a male point of view, like you've got to be tough, and that's what it's kind of known for, and you need to be masculine. So yeah, it was going back and forward with that, and just discussing perhaps some of the stigma that still is prevalent today.
Well, this is absolutely brilliant research, Olivia, and as I mentioned, we are on slightly limited time today, so I really do want to get you both back on to discuss this further. What just briefly, what's next for you, Olivia? Where are you taking this line of research?
Yeah, so I think for me, this research was really to add another lens to the conversation that is happening, to not neglect this group of players, this level, because like I said, now, and even since this paper's been when we first did this research, tier 3 is like growing at such a speed. Like I said, if you look at the Northern National League now, the top 4 teams are either hybrid or full-time professional. So it really does, and I think in the first team, what the key is that navigating. Like we said, we're not saying that mental health, ill health won't, we're not trying to completely get rid of that, and it will occur. And again, we're not trying to say environments can't be competitive. We're not going to experience these key triggers or key specific causes, but actually, as the growth of the women's sport is increasing, how are we allowing players to flourish? And I just think it really adds that extra lens, and really hopefully opens up that conversation to have that debate, and for people to share their own experiences, to say, in this situation, this happened. So yeah, I think for me, that is kind of where I found like it was really important to publish this piece of research, to really start that conversation, and open up a new discussion.
Well, absolutely fantastic, and I can't thank you both enough for your time. Coming to you first, Laura, how can people find you, follow you, and get in touch?
So probably the easiest way is to Google Laura Healy, Healy, and you should find my staff page NTU. And that's got all my research interests and papers on it. Probably should mention this paper is open access, so if anyone does want to read it, they should be able to find access to that, and there's no barrier to it, so even if you're not part of the university. My email address is laura.healy@ntu.ac.uk, and happy for people to contact me on that, or to follow me on Twitter, which is @LauraHealyBob.
And Olivia, how can people find you, follow you, and potentially get in touch?
So I'd say probably the main one is via LinkedIn. It used to be on Twitter/X, but we won't get into why I try and avoid my usage of that. But yeah, so the main one is probably going to be on LinkedIn, and that is just Olivia Bramley, or one of my many emails, olivia.bramley@rmit.edu.au. And yeah, like I said, as lawyers, like happy to be contacted, happy to have further discussions. And I do encourage other people to pick up this research, like get into it yourself and really take it and progress it and keep digging into these conversations.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Site Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.